So now I'm going to talk about the societal perception of minorities in modern day in relation to long-term effects of redlining. It is important to understand the disadvantages that minorities face based solely on race because it can provide context as to why the gap, specifically between white and black quality of life, still exists. There is a logical progression of being raised in an underfunded area, leading to lower educational resources, worse job opportunities, a lower credit score, and then the inability to receive a loan. This buildup causes the inescapable cycle of disadvantage. The banning of redlining did not stop the continued effects into the 90s, which, as previously explained, because of the evolution of discriminatory methods that benefited from the exploitation of African Americans and other minorities. Discrimination will always be an ever-changing issue, and without rigorous countermeasures, the issue will continue to mutate and grow. One cannot simply ban prevailing discriminatory practices and declare the struggle for racial equality won. Given the historical depth and institutionalized longevity of racism in the United States, it is logical to assume that new mechanisms of racial subordination will be invented as others are eliminated. And that's a quote from Racial Discrimination in Housing, pages 148 to 149. Discrimination is such a multifaceted issue that it cannot be solved with one minor law change, as we saw with the Fair Housing Act, which is why making redlining illegal was ineffective at removing housing discrimination completely. The idea that discrimination no longer existed was what continued the belief that Black Americans were incapable of operating at the same level as white people, otherwise known as white supremacy. Residential discrimination disadvantages African Americans' mobility, and this is proved by generational analysis of turnover in neighborhoods. Among African Americans beginning in the poorest quarter of the U.S. neighborhoods, 2 out of 3 remain in the poorest quarter of neighborhoods in the next generation, and 1 out of 3 advance upward into a neighborhood with less poverty. The figures for whites present a very different story. About 40% of whites originating in the poorest American neighborhoods remain there in the next generation, and 60% move upward. That's a quote by Sharkey on page 38. The idea of intergenerational poverty is very common within Black families, and it was linked to the continuous disadvantage of Black populations historically with no modern solution. Some of the main reasons that were crucial to understanding why inequality in urban neighborhoods has been so persistent are: number one, the failure to complete the progression towards full civil rights. Number two, the implementation of a diverse set of policies and formal strategies and institutional mechanisms used to maintain racial inequality in urban areas. And number three, the restructuring of urban labor markets. And number four, the destructive response to economic dislocation in America's cities. That's a quote from Sharkey, page 48. The lack of opportunity for upward social growth was due to intersecting constraints on Black American populations that kept a complete social revolution from happening after the banning of redlining. The effects of racial discrimination were amplified by the idea of intersectionality, where many parts of an identity come together to form an overall compounded disadvantage. Black women faced additional challenges. Quote, Susan was repeatedly denied an opportunity to rent an apartment where prospective landlords learned that she had children. She had reasonable hope that she would find a place in a decent area for what income I could afford to pay, yet was still illegally denied access as a result of her status as an African American mother with too many children. That's a quote from Rachinho, 59. This type of cumulative discrimination was why continued disadvantage was so hard for Black Americans to escape from. Intersectionality complicated basic racial discrimination, especially in the case of housing, due to the role of economic requirements. It is important to acknowledge that economic discrimination was separate from racial, but the two intersect in many different ways, with racial discrimination in job markets and schooling, as discrimination follows individuals throughout their entire lives, therefore affecting their economic prospects. The effects of redlining continued well into the 90s, even past the banning of the practice, because the principles on which it was founded opened the door for reimagined methods of housing discrimination that benefited from the disadvantage of Black Americans.